Is the suicide barrier on the Golden Gate Bridge saving lives? So, trigger warning that this is a discussion about suicide and deaths by suicide. If you're thinking of harming or killing yourself, there is a nationwide suicide and crisis hotline, just dialing 988. That's staffed 24 hours a day. It is anonymous. And there are also many local supplementary sources of help in most parts of the United States. So I'll start as usual with the take-home message, and that is the Golden Gate Bridge has been a suicide magnet, meaning many people have gone there to kill themselves. A barrier was finally constructed and finished more than a year ago, and in the first year after construction, deaths on the bridge have dropped from about 30 a year to 80 a year. And this has been touted as showing that these barriers save lives. As I will go into, I think there is no compelling evidence that they are actually saving lives, and it's far more likely that they are deflecting suicide deaths to other locations. In January of 2024, after 7 years and $398 million, workers completed a suicide prevention barrier on the Golden Gate Bridge. And again, this has been celebrated in nationwide newspapers as a measure to save lives. Construction on the Golden Gate Bridge was completed in 1933, and experts estimate that at least 2,000 individuals have died from jumping from the bridge in the 90 years since then, 90 plus. That makes it the number 1 or 2 destination in the world, depending on whose counts you value. So drawing people in, estimates are that somewhere between 8 to 10% of people are actually traveling to the Golden Gate Bridge expressly to kill themselves. Most of the deaths have been Californians, most particularly Northern Californians and people in the Bay Area. Now, the numbers are somewhat subject to question. In the last decade, there have been 24-hour surveillance cameras on the bridge, and direct observations have documented at least 30 deaths a year before the barrier was constructed. Tallies from further in the past are thought to be underestimates, since some bodies are never recovered from the straits of the Golden Gate Bridge below. As a psychiatrist, I've known 2 different individuals who died jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge. I strongly support efforts to reduce suicide. But again, I think the research on suicide suggests that rather than saving lives, the barriers are more likely redirecting suicide attempts to other locations. And particularly at this point in our nation's history, where there's a reduced willingness to spend money on support of the social safety net and to help the most vulnerable among us, it's critically important that we channel resources in the directions that are most likely to help. So the Golden Gate Bridge not only is one of the most popular suicide destinations, it's one of the most iconic and widely photographed landmarks in the world. It links the city of San Francisco with Marin County to the north, span of 1.7 miles, that's 2.7 kilometers. Both ends of the bridge are anchored in parts of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It's the former Presidio military base on the San Francisco side, and part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area on the Marin side. 2-lane traffic on the roadbed and pedestrian walkways flank both sides of the road. Sidewalks are about 220 feet above the chilly waters of the Strait of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is an inlet from the Pacific Ocean into San Francisco Bay. Now, a human body falling from the bridge hits the waves in about 4 seconds with an impact close to 80 miles an hour. That's a collision at highway speeds without protection of seatbelts, airbag, or even the car itself. Very few survive that fall. Now, there have been enhanced both emergency rescue procedures and hospital trauma services on the Marin side of the bridge, where most of the survivors and rescue efforts take place. And that did boost survival rates from about 1 or 2% to about 3% of people who go over the edge surviving in recent years. Most of those who do survive are left with permanent disabilities. Many of those who have survived have gone on to embrace life, and very few of them attempt suicide again. Many of the people who've jumped and survived have become vocal advocates, advocating for reducing suicide risks, including putting suicide barriers on the bridge. Now, for years, mental health workers, the family of those harmed, survivors, have lobbied to add the barrier to the bridge to reduce its use for suicide. And some of the fiercest resistance to such a project came from those who were worried that any of these structures would mar the aesthetics of the bridge. I mean, this may be not just an aesthetic issue, it may be a commercial one, given again, this is one of the most widely photographed structures of the world, and they didn't want people to be dissuaded from coming and taking pictures if it looks ugly. So there was a lot of thought and planning to make the structure as unobtrusive as possible. It's painted the same orangish, reddish color, which is officially known as Golden Gate Orange. Others question, could you really make a barrier that's completely suicide-proof? And some of the authorities argued that this would be a 100% effective barrier. So it was proposed at a cost of $71 million. Off-site construction began in 2017. So assembling the struts, assembling this network of, it's a cable network, hangs about 20 feet below the roadbed and extends about 20 feet away from the sides of the edge of the railing. So it's virtually impossible to jump and miss this net, but someone can land on this net. Falling 20 feet itself often results in injuries. But as turned out to be the case, this is not 100% effective. Some people have landed on the net and then proceeded to crawl across the net, the edge of the net, to fall into the water. Now, in addition to this physical barrier, there have been a squad of both bridge employees for years, and more recently, a squad of volunteers, angels, they are labeled, who have patrolled the bridge to prevent suicide. These members are trained to detect certain behaviors of who might have suicidal intent. How quickly are people walking? What are they looking at? Are they snapping pictures? Are they looking over the edge for access? And they're also trained to engage the individuals and use mental health skills to try to discourage them from suicide and to stall someone going over the edge until more help can arrive to deter that, including physically if possible. In the past decade, bridge volunteers have successfully intercepted many more people than the number who went on to die by suicide. So these angels, volunteers, were actually quite effective suicide barrier, not completely effective, but substantially. So the year before the barrier went up, about 100 interventions at least successfully deterred potential suicides. Again, that was in a year. About 30 people did commit suicide, so at least 3 times as many were stopped. In the first year of the barrier being present, the barrier, the number of interventions by these volunteers and staff increased, so it was about 130 interventions. And that suggests that the netting, or at least contemplating how to get in or around the netting, slowed people down enough to add to additional chances for human assistance to intercede. Jumping back a little to the bigger picture of suicide in general, in the US and other industrialized countries, suicide is one of the top 10 causes of death. That's across all ages. And among those under 45, it's consistently in the top 3 or 4 for each of the age groups under 45. So particularly for young people, and young people are losing more of their prospective lifetime, this is a major public health issue. And many people are surprised to learn that in the total population, the general population, suicide is twice as prevalent as homicide, despite, yes, there are celebrity cases where suicide gets lots of attention, but murder gets far more regular press when it's only half the size of the problem of suicide. Now, true rates of suicide are actually undoubtedly higher than what official statistics indicate, given that lots of single car accidents, substance overdoses, other deaths that are likely suicides are not registered in official records as such, because there's either a lack of clear-cut evidence documenting, determining that they were, or in many cases, family members, medical examiners, police omit reporting signs that would support the conclusion that it was suicide, just because there is so much stigma still attached to it. So many of these deaths are reported as accidents. In the last 10 years, approximately 49,000 Americans a year are known to have died by suicide, and firearms are far and away the biggest method used. More than half of these deaths in both genders, so it's not just a man thing, it's more women too. In contrast, suicide by falling from heights are just a proverbial drop in the bucket, less than 2% of total. So jumping from bridges, ledges, tall buildings is not a particularly common mode of killing oneself in our country or in this day and age. The most successful public health suicide reduction efforts have targeted methods of suicide that people have rapid access to and that are highly lethal. So these include things like bans on insecticides, changing coal gas out for natural gas in Britain, and gun control laws. So in parts of Asia, consuming insecticides, poisons that are used to kill insects and that are readily available at agricultural stores, many of those, that was one of the most common ways to commit suicide. And different countries have put restrictions on these products, so limiting the toxicity to humans or restricting access. So the general public did not have access to these insecticides, and measurable decreases in suicide deaths, not just deaths by that method, but suicide. In Great Britain, in the post-war years, one of the most common ways of committing suicide was sticking one's head in the proverbial oven. And that was because coal gas, which was used to heat homes, is quite toxic. And natural gas, not that it can't be toxic if it deprives you of all oxygen, but it's considerably less toxic. When coal gas was switched out for natural gas, the overall rate of suicide deaths in Britain decreased. And then there's a number of jurisdictions comparing different state laws, looking at Switzerland, looking at Australia, other areas, where after restricting either access to guns or restricting access to ammunition or mandating locks or boxes or restricting the guns could be kept in the household, those measures measurably reduced suicide deaths. Now, all of these public health approaches had a positive impact because they were targeting means of death that were common or prevalent, that had a high likelihood of resulting in death, and that could be accessed within seconds to minutes, usually in the privacy of one's home. Now, most of the research on suicidality focuses on sadness and despair and how people progress from thinking about death to coming up with a plan to death, motivating to actually acting on the plan. In the US, about 13 million adults seriously consider suicide each year. Only about a quarter of those make a formal, clear-cut plan of how they want to do it. And half of those who formulate a plan act on it. So that's more than 1.6 million suicide attempts. But only a quarter of such suicide attempts actually result in death. So there's decreased numbers dramatically as we go from just thinking about suicide to actually dying from suicide. Now, women constitute the majority of individuals contemplating and even attempting suicide by almost a 3-to-1 ratio. But the proportion of suicide deaths is strikingly a man thing. So men account for 80% of deaths. And some of that's that they, even though their firearms are the most common method among both genders, there is a higher propensity for highly lethal methods and maybe more certain approaches to dealing with carrying out suicidal attempts. Most, again, the research is focused on depression, despair, not wanting to live, but impulsivity is recognized but widely understudied as a major contributor to suicide. And it's really depressing that even in recent years, even once impulsivity has been recognized, suicide researchers, when they're looking at different risks for other mental health conditions and contributing to suicide, assess their population for, did these individuals have depression? Did they have bipolar? Did they have schizophrenia? Did they have substance use? Did they have PTSD? All of which do increase the risk for suicide. And all of these are things that focus on deterioration in the quality of life or causing misery to life. And these do contribute to suicide. But almost never do these general purpose studies on suicide even look at ADHD, which is the prototypical impulse control disorder. Now, there are studies, numerous studies, looking at the population of ADHD and looking at people with ADHD do kill themselves by suicide at twice the rate of the general population. And the silver lining in some of that is that treatment of ADHD with stimulant medications reduces the rate back down to the general population rate, doesn't prevent all of it. but further evidence that a substantial part of suicide deaths aren't just feeling despair or depression, but feeling an impulsive decision in view of those feelings. Now, during the last decade, the rate of suicide in the US and many other countries has been increasing fairly steadily over the last 20 years. But during COVID, first year of it, there was actually a measurable decrease in the actual number of deaths. This is present in country after country. One cannot possibly conceivably argue that anxiety decreased, depression decreased, PTSD, none of these decreased. PTSD went up, domestic violence went up, substance use went up, depression went up, anxiety, despair, all increased at a time suicide rate decreased early in the COVID epidemic. Since then, it's resumed its higher levels. The only plausible explanation I can come up with is that the decrease in suicide deaths was because people had reduced opportunities for highly lethal methods. So being confined for home, for either work or for school, having people around you, having less privacy, having roommates, family members that were constantly nearby, reduced opportunities and reduced the impulsive component. It made it less likely some impulse would lead you to kill yourself. People were still killing themselves. It's still historically high records or rates, but those were people who were planning out methodically and figuring out when people wouldn't be nearby, when people couldn't intercede. So again, both the dip in suicide rates during COVID and the efficacy of public health measures that reduce accessibility are indicating that our point of intervention is regarding the impulsivity. It's not regarding despair or depression. Again, switching out what kind of insecticides are legally available and accessible, or reducing the availability of guns, or switching out coal gas didn't change rates of despair or depression in any of these areas. Rather, what they seem to prevent were some of the spur-of-the-moment decisions that result in death. And some of this wisdom is actually captured in the folk saying that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I mean, that identifies that there is a strong element of impulsivity, of looking at the moment and thinking that's everything and not being aware of the long-term consequences. I'm not saying that everyone who kills themselves isn't thinking of long-term consequences. I'm saying that many of the people who kill themselves are acting in an impulsive plus despairing way, not just a despairing way. Brings us back to the question, is the Golden Gate Bridge really that accessible and lethal? Now, on the surface, it looks like it is. Fits a formula for successful public health intervention. It's highly lethal. Again, 99, 98, 97% of people, once they've gone over the edge, die, and only takes a few seconds to go over the railing and die. The Golden Gate Bridge, again, is an unmoving target. You know it's going to be there. You know, it's not like counting on jumping in front of a train and not knowing when it will arrive. And it's within a few miles drive of more than 7.5 million people in the Bay Area. Lots of people live there. Seems accessible. But if we look at it in more detail, there's only a few thousand people at most who live with even a 15-minute walk of either end of the bridge. Almost nobody lives near the northern end, the Marin side, which is, again, mostly parkland. And in the Presidio, there are some former military housing that is now available for people to live there. But most people, even in San Francisco, would have to walk well over 15 minutes to get from their home to the Golden Gate Bridge. Most people who jump from the bridge do need to take a car or take a bus. So that means you need to prepare to get out of your house. You probably need to put clothes on. I mean, you could walk naked to the bridge, but you're more likely to get stopped on the way there. So for most people, they are taking a sustained, concerted effort to get to the bridge, consuming a greater part of an hour, sometimes considerably more. And there are multiple opportunities for reflection and consideration of other options if you're even really set on killing yourself. So very few of the Golden Gate Bridge suicides result from spontaneous, rapid decision-making. I'll get back to that. Some probably do. So regarding the lethality, the experts say 90% likelihood of death. That's greater than the likelihood of shooting yourself. When you shoot yourself, sometimes people miss entirely. A significant fraction of the time, people depending on where they are aiming the gun, cause grievous injury to their body or head, but don't kill themselves. So this looks like it's pretty lethal. Lethality is actually tied in with the issue of accessibility, and the true measure of lethality time should start for when you make a committed decision to kill yourself using a particular technique. So again, before the barrier was erected, suicide prevention crews intercepted more than 3 times as many people. That means the lethality of this method is even if you decide to kill yourself, you're firmly committed, you go to the Golden Gate Bridge and start walking across, less than 25% of people killed themselves that way. That's a lethality of less than 25%. And in recent years, again, more volunteers involved in this good effort, lethality was brought down closer to 10 to 12%. That does not make jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge a particularly lethal method. Horribly, it's lethal for some, but that just does not qualify as a highly lethal method. Over the years, the San Francisco Chronicle has highlighted numerous articles about some of the most poignant stories of bridge suicides. They've detailed how, and most of the articles, most of the individuals they've detailed have been teenagers or young adults who saved up money for cab fare or spent hours investigating on the internet how to get to the Golden Gate Bridge, how to kill themselves there. And almost always, these young individuals were not sharing what they were doing with their parents or siblings or friends. They were doing it in secret. It was a complete surprise to their family. And I applaud the families who, after the tremendous loss of their children, have become advocates for reducing death by suicide. It's still stigma tied to suicide. They've been brave in advocating for this. They've been brave in sharing their stories. Their motives are great and wonderful for trying to ensure that other families don't suffer the way they have. But powerful altruistic feelings don't always equate to wise action. And while bridge barriers may well have prevented these young people from dying at the Golden Gate Bridge, I have not seen any compelling case indicating that such barriers would have deterred these individuals from their determination to die. I mean, if someone is researching killing themselves for 2 weeks or saving up money to spend on cab fare, they are pretty determined and pretty certain. And it's likely, if they know that Golden Gate Bridge is not likely to be an effective means of killing themselves, I think it's highly likely that they would have focused their attention on some other means to kill themselves. Some people posit there is something special about, that the bridge is a suicide magnet. And there's a phenomenon called the call of the void, where there's a sudden, brief impulse to jump when you're near the edge of a cliff or other high perch. This is actually a fairly common phenomenon. It's not extensively studied. There's a few studies suggesting anywhere from a quarter to more than half of people have at least experienced this a few times. And the available evidence, again, scanty, does not seem to particularly associate that with previous suicidal thoughts or actually going on to have any suicidal thoughts, but it suggests that there's something innate in our wiring that tall spaces may bring out this feeling. So I've experienced this, and I've actually experienced it on the Golden Gate Bridge. So for years, I was a marathon runner. There's been several dozen times when I run across the Golden Gate Bridge, usually in the dawn hours before sunrise, when many of those occasions I was the only individual on the whole bridge sidewalk. That's highly unusual during daylight hours. There are almost always throngs of sightseers and visitors on the bridge. And there have been several times I was gripped by the fear. And for me, it wasn't an urge to hurl myself over the railing as much as a feeling I might do that, or I could do that, or it would be so simple or easy. And, it was more fear that I would without really a desire that I should do that. I would sort of shiver. I would hug the edge of the sidewalk close to the adjacent lanes of car traffic, and I would hurry on my way. And, the feeling would usually be brief and not persist. Now, there have been a few Golden Gate Bridge suicide deaths that have been profiled in the local papers where the individuals had no clear history of depression or other mental health conditions, who left no evidence, no note, other recordings or indication that they were planning on their death. Family and friends have sort of speculated, were these people victims of the call of the void or something else tied in with the bridge? But it's important to remember that many of these people who do commit suicide are adept at hiding their despair. But I would concede it's still possible. It's conceivable to me that some of the people who did jump from the bridge, again, it's probably at most a small fraction, did not go to the bridge thinking even of the possibility of suicide. It was something about the call of the void or other aspects of being on the bridge that just led to a sudden impulse. So there has been also speculation, sort of more spiritual, I would even call it woo-woo, connected with San Francisco and Marin, that there's something seductive about the bridge, that there's evil spirits, or there's forces, or there's something about the vortex of the Strait of the Golden Gate pouring into San Francisco Bay below it that actually elicits self-destructive urges from people. More than 90% of the deaths by suicide have been Californians, but some people do travel from long distances, even from not just foreign states, but from different countries to die at the bridge. I mean, whether this is a phenomena of talking about the mystique of dying from the bridge or not, I don't know. And tied in with this, some of the speculation surrounds that a vast majority of the suicide from the bridge happen on the east side. That's the side facing San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, the cities of the Bay, and very few die from the west, which is ocean-facing side. Some people have claimed this is a statement people are making about the inhumanity of civilization and a rejection or a rebuttal to civilization, but there is a more prosaic explanation, and that is for decades at least, all the time I was living in San Francisco, the west side of the bridge is locked at nighttime, so completely not readily accessible, and during the daytime is restricted to bicyclists. So if you try walking as a pedestrian, you will be stopped and told this side is only for bicyclists. Interestingly, and this is observed in other areas as well, I mean, there are other bridges over the Bay Bridge, over the water in the San Francisco area. The Bay Bridge is nearby. It's not quite as iconic, but it's distinguished bridge. It's a high platform. You would probably die if you jumped from it. Bay Bridge links Oakland and San Francisco. But suicides on the Bay Bridge have been dramatically less frequent. And in many other cities with multiple potentially lethal bridges, the suicidal tolls are almost never evenly distributed, but centered on the most majestic or notorious bridges. And it's not clear to me what that says about human nature, but to me, it's probably saying more about human nature than saying something about some spiritual phenomena tied to the location itself. Those advocating for suicide deterrent on the bridge often bring up that the majority of people who survive falling from the bridge renounce their suicidal feelings and never again try to kill themselves. And the data is really confusing and mixed in this, and it sounds contradictory. So in general, most people who die of suicide have made previous near lethal attempts. That's a true statement. And compared to the general population, having made a near lethal attempt makes one more likely to make another attempt or to die from suicide in the future. But at the same time, most people who survive a near lethal attempt don't die from a later suicide. So again, the numbers work out because, again, only about a quarter of near lethal suicide attempts result in death. So I think it's wonderful that previously suicidal individuals want to live. That's great. It's also not surprising that if you survive an event that only 1, 2, 3% of people survive, you may suddenly feel that your very survival is a providential message and you should value your own life. But whether a survivor learns to find value in living is not actually directly relevant to the question of whether suicide barriers deter suicide or merely deflect them to other locations. And this is such an emotional subject that many people have difficulty following the logic. So I'll state it more generically. So if we're looking at whether intervention X, barrier, leads to outcome Y, no suicidal death, then whether the individual likes or dislikes the outcome of Y doesn't tell us anything about the effectiveness of intervention X. So one widely touted study looking at the impact of suicide barriers looked at Washington, D.C.'s Ellington Bridge, another suicide magnet not as prominent as the Golden Gate Bridge. After they put barriers there was a 90% decrease in suicides from that bridge. And then they looked at deaths from other adjacent bridges, and they did not find any increase in deaths there. And again, this has been used to claim that people don't go elsewhere if their first choice is being blocked. It does not prove that at all. It just showed that people weren't going to other bridges or they couldn't detect a boost. And it seems terribly naive to claim that this is the case. I mean, I've worked with lots of people who have been obsessed or focused on suicide for decades. Most of them are focused on dying or not wanting to live. They're not focused on one particular mode of killing themselves. And if that's deprived of them, they say, oh, then I'm happy with living. The statistical challenge and more perspective, in the Bay Area, there's about 1,000 suicide deaths annually. That makes it really hard to detect if the 30 potential suicides a year that were happening on the Golden Gate Bridge are completely gone. That would be a change of less than 3%. So it's really hard to detect whether people are changing their location and means of killing themselves or just deciding to live because they can't kill themselves on the Golden Gate Bridge. Other point to make is that while we can reduce some risks, we're not going to be able to block access to all the tall buildings, all the ledges, all the bridges. We can't keep people away from fast cars and trains, people from owning ropes and belts and bed sheets. We're not going to ever make the world completely safe from physical means of suicide. So we should be focusing more on mental health efforts to change how people are feeling about suicide. So in conclusion, the Golden Gate Bridge suicide is not highly prevalent, was not readily accessible, or not a highly lethal means of suicide. It does not match the profile of what effective public health suicide prevention strategies have found. For a while, I felt, or for years, that maybe symbolically this was a good investment, that this was giving the message, we see you as a society, we value you, we want you to live. But increasingly, I worry that someone looking at the suicide barriers on the bridge may see it simply as NIMBYism, that it's really conveying, don't ruin the aesthetics of my bridge by jumping from here, and that actually might increase feelings of alienation and despair in people who are already suicidal. So we're living in an era with restricted resources and less general willingness to support the social safety net. More people are distrustful of experts. So to make claims that something is 100% suicide proof, and then it doesn't turn out to be, that not just only diminishes credibility, but then it makes it particularly tragic for those who do still die from the Golden Gate Bridge. The other thing is cost. This was originally budgeted $71 million. If newspaper keeps touting it for $224 million price tag, the contractor who did the work said, and who sued the bridge authority multiple times, said the total cost has run closer to $398 million. That would buy a lot of trigger locks for guns. That would probably have saved many more deaths. And it would have saved not just suicide deaths, but accidental deaths. But fortunately, we have one free way of dealing with suicide, no cost to everyone, and that's talking about it more. We should invest in talking with each other about suicide. We can check in with people who seem to be in despair. And research indicates that talking about suicide does not plant the idea in people's minds. That you can remind people that there are effective strategies for treating depression, despair, and emotional dysregulation and impulsivity. And we can remind people that they live in a world where others care and want them to be alive. Having those conversations is free, and that could be a matter of life or death. That's all. Take care of yourself.